the worth. I was reading one of the biography of Loren Cunningham, whose ministry, Youth with a Mission, YWAM, has been used and employs tens of thousands of young people all over the nation. And Loren Cunningham was telling the story of one of the converts that he has led to the Lord, whose name his name was Enrico. And right when he leads them to the Lord in Paris, this in Italy, this Italian man who owned his own lumber yard. I was so amazed by this man's testimony that I just quickly made a copy of this as I was looking at this. He said Enrico was a new believer and he was in the construction business, and not long after he came to know the Lord as his personal Savior, he says late one night he was walking near his lumber yard, and while he was there he saw two figures jump out of a truck, break the lock on his fence, and start loading all of his lumber. This brand new Christian is watching his own lumber yard absolutely being ripped off right in front of him. And so he sits there, and so instead of going and jumping to conclusions, he begins to count it all joy and begin to say, okay, God, let me assess the situation. Let me not just jump in and just do it and say, what's going on? Let me call 911. And he began to ask the Lord, what should I do? And a plan came to his mind. It says in his biography, he walked over to the two men who were now already loading. Both of their trucks were full of lumber. And after a few minutes, he begins to come over, and he started helping the men load the lumber. He started coming over and says, let me help you with these 2x4s. Let me help you with all this wood. And these men were just so thankful that someone was helping them steal all the lumber. After a few minutes, he goes, what are you going to use this lumber for? And the men said, we're going to use this to sell at different places. And they looked at him, he said, you're such a good thief. He goes, oh, I'm not a thief. I'm the owner of this place. And all of a sudden, the men began to become fearful and began to start backing away from him. And the story goes on to say, he says, I knew what you were doing, Enrico said, but I'm not a thief. You see, I'm not a thief because this is my lumber yard and this is my lumber. And the Christian man replied, don't be afraid. I saw what you were doing, but decided not to call the police. Evidently, you just don't know how to live right yet. So I'm going to teach you. You can have this lumber, but first I want you to hear what I have to say. This man not only led him to Jesus, one is a pastor today and one is a deacon of a church today. That something began to happen, that God began to use this man. And instead of just jumping in and going, my lumber yard's being ripped off, he began to say, God, let me realize that in every trial I go through, something can come out of that thing that's there. Count it all joy when you encounter various trials. It's not to put you through difficulty, but God has a reason and a purpose through everything that you go through.